Hello and welcome to these conversations. I feel that they're extremely important right now, as much as they've always been. We're talking about creating inclusive platforms and new narratives. And with me, my name is Amelia Hoy, and with me is Ervin Latimer from Finland. Hello and welcome.
Hi, how's it going?
Going really well. How are you doing?
I am super excited about this talk. Super
Oh,
happy that we get
wonderful.
to have this conversation.
I'm so glad. So, you are a designer, you're a writer, you're many things. Tell us a bit about your experiences and observations in the fashion industry with everything that you bring to the table.
Sure. Uh, at the moment, I'm working more on personal projects, but prior to last summer, I was working for roughly 2 years in the industry. Um, so for the past, starting from last summer, the past year, I was working in Copenhagen as a design manager at a local brand there, and then before that in Italy at a luxury label over there as a junior designer. And before that, I was basically at school. So even though I might not have the longest experience in the industry for sure, I've I've, I've been lucky enough to have positions where I sort of get to see how things are done. And I mean, it's interesting to work in a field and work in an industry that by design we're supposed to create new things and be sort of at the forefront of things. However, the sort of system that runs fashion is quite old fashioned, and there's
Mm,
quite old hierarchical systems that exist there, especially when discussing positions of power and power in general, and where you get to make decisions. So I think to be concise, like one of the biggest things that I've learned is that it matters who is in the position of power and who
hmm.
is the person that gets to make the calls. Because even though your intentions might be good, there's still often things that are sort of lost in translation and lost in the focus when in a position of power you're acting in from your point of view, and that point of view usually is something else than marginalized, let's put it this way.
Absolutely. And when we start talking about these new platforms and creating a more inclusive narrative about
Mhm.
minorities, but also diversity at large, what do you think can be done to create more inclusive spaces within these structures? Because, as you said, coming up in this industry, it's really hard to make any sort of change from within. So, where do you think the change should come from?
Well, I think the change must and is coming from new talents and new people working in the industry. And I think there is an like culturally we're in this interesting moment where there is change happening within companies, within fashion companies, in terms of if we're discussing diversity and inclusivity.
Hmm.
However, that change usually stems, these companies work in a capitalist system. So that change and that will for change usually stems from someone possibly losing money or losing something else PR wise. So
Mm.
again, like the sort of will and drive for change, it seems, is not always driven by will for change, it's driven by money. So that's why to me, we also need new voices in the industry, and we need new people in positions of power where we can make sure that things such as inclusivity and diversity, um, so that happens. How should I say? So that there's true diversity, a true inclusivity. Because again, I think there's a calculated way of doing that is happening right now, where there's someone always benefiting from that inclusivity and diversity. But I think we're still a few steps away from that moment where that will happen, because we understand that there's a specific image of a designer or creative director or a powerful person in fashion or model, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, we're starting to talk about, and I know you and I have spoken about the fact that more and more brands are now becoming more adept to the fact that, well, if they do have inclusivity within their brand DNA,
Mhm.
then they're going to effectively sell more product because there is a
Mhm.
huge and growing and very diverse marketplace out there. And you kind of mentioned it now, but what are some of the pitfalls in only being motivated by, effectively, by money?
By money, yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest pitfalls is that, like, we, for example, people of color like you and me, we see through that. It's quite. It's not so difficult to see like where that sort of will for representation stems from, if you understand what I mean. So again, if you have that one person of color in your campaign instead of zero, like, okay, great, but like what happens next? What's the next step? Why did this happen? Why is it just that one person? Why is it happen only now when everyone else is doing that? So, and this isn't like, I don't mean to sound unthankful is the wrong word. Like, I don't want to sound unappreciative. However, like, I think some of the pitfalls are, yes, that like, it's easy to see that it doesn't come from a natural will for change, because if we're talking about change, if we're talking about adding diversity, that's not something that can just happen from the top level of the company saying that, okay, we need to do this. It has to happen within the company on a personal level, within the staff. It has to happen on an organizational level within the company, and it should happen from above the company, from a governmental level, etc. So that's this sort of unthankful challenge here, that when you're pushing for change, first of all, it's not enough if you do it alone, and also it's a lot of work. And I think that's the thing where often maybe companies don't realize that it is work. It's not enough if you have one person come and consult your company for one campaign, and then you do one or two campaigns. This is continuous work that requires push, and it's oftentimes not very easy to do that. So I think that's the thing where, like, I can come up with so many examples, or I can think of many examples where I can see that, okay, there's probably a will for change and probably a will to broaden representation, but there's not really an understanding why that's happening.
Absolutely. And, no, absolutely. And I think I usually start these talks with the disclaimer saying, talking about anti-racist practices within a fashion industry, let alone a Scandinavian fashion industry, is not something we're going to solve in this conversation, in the next conversation, or in the next several seasons. This is an ongoing process of work, like you said, that requires dedication and time and energy on multiple layers within the industry at the same time across the Nordic region, which is why I'm so excited that we're able to also reach out and create some of these bridges between the Scandinavian countries to start talking about this, because just like climate change, it's not something you can solve one person alone in one country. But the more we create these collaborations and conversations, the more we're able to do. And speaking of that, collaborations and platforms, I'd love to know, I know a little bit about Roskte, but I would love to know more where you're writing, know more about that platform, know more about what it has been able to achieve in the Finnish fashion industry.
Sure. So Roskte is a nonprofit organization that I'm working for as the managing editor at the media side of the organization. We were founded in 2016. Our founder, author and writer, Koko Hubara, back then she had a very popular blog, and she really was one of the first people in Finland in the field of media and writing, I would say, that would discuss brownness and whiteness, and would literally bring for the first time in the Finnish language vocabulary related to racism. And quite quickly she realized that because of the popularity of the blog, that there is a community that we have here in Finland that requires its own media, that brings marginalized people, that brings people who are not seen as the norm or presented as the norm in media, that they need their own platform and own media. So in 2016, we started Roskte Media, and we launched it in 2017, and now we've been running for close to 4 years now. And I can't give you exact data what the change has been in Finland, but let's put it this way, that when we started our media and our organization, our founder Coco Hubara, she was doing interviews where like for the biggest media houses in our country, where like actual questions were like, well, what about reverse racism, and what about does this sort of questioning of does racism, is it a problem in Scandinavian countries? Everything else is so fine over here, so is it really an issue here? And we've come a very long way from that. So I'm super pleased about that, and I think we've been able to introduce a big new voice in Finland in terms of from the point of view of people of color and point of view of marginalized people. And we discussed this earlier a little bit, that it's interesting how in Scandinavian countries, because we have a lot of different kinds of minorities, people with a sub-Saharan African background, people with a Middle Eastern background, et cetera, it's interesting how we're sort of all lumped in this one abstract group of,
yeah,
exactly, one group that is the other, that is somehow, depending on the language and words that you use, is a foreigner or an immigrant or a mixture of those things. So it's also been interesting to see that when we've been working for our organization, that yes, we're working for that community, but within that sort of group, people are saying like, oh, like we need more stories like this and this, and why are you featuring only that and that? And we see that as a positive thing, because it made us realize that there is diversity within this country, and there are people who don't feel seen within this country. So there's a lot to be done over there. And even though we feature stories related to culture, etc., I think that's also because of Roskte, that because of sort of what I've learned there, that also has reflected on me, myself as a designer, and the design work that I do.
Absolutely. And one thing that I think is really interesting in Roskte and the things that you're pointing out right now is the ability to create, because this is really some of what we're talking about now, is the ability to create new narratives, but also to create new language that is inclusive in its very form, which is something that I know Roskte has done a lot. And I'm so interested to hear how your work with them in a platform that is really made for and made by brown and black girls to also take that language and those narratives into your design. And by the way, congratulations with winning your prize. Tell us a little bit about how you've also been able to use your designs to tell new stories and use new language.
Sure. Thank you. So, last year I was selected as the Young Designer of the Year in Finland, which is the oldest award in fashion in Finland, and I guess the most prominent one or whatever.
Hey, take it, girl, take it.
So, yes, now I'm very glad that I won that with the story and with the sort of point that I was trying to make with the collection that I won it with. It's interesting because I think, as you know, as a brown creative, you tend to incorporate sort of, if you don't feel seen in the society that you work in as a creative, you tend to incorporate that somehow in your work. So for me, it came very naturally, even before the existence of Roskte, to include my intersecting identities as a brown man, as a homosexual man in a country like Finland. So that was always there. But I think what was interesting, sort of through working with Roskte and learning from these amazing women that I've been working with, is how it sort of helped me to find, if not nuance, but a new deeper level for the importance of that work. Because it really, even though I was doing that for myself quite quickly, and even with this Young Designer of the Year collection, I realized that it's also, I'm doing it for myself, but it really is for the community, and there is a lot that the community is getting from that work. And just to open up the background a little bit, so the collection that I did for the competition, the main point was about gender expression and how how the pieces of clothing don't have gender, but we use that to build a specific performance of gender, and how clothing can be used to sort of obscure that, etc. But at large, especially with the image that I created for that collection and the images that we took and sound and video that we've created for that, the point really was that there's a stereotype and there's a cliche of a Nordic fashion image, and who is seen in the Nordic fashion image. It's usually a beautiful, skinny, tall, uber blonde woman, in the nature. So sort of a big thing at a larger scale for me was to sort of try to own that image and try to recreate that image into something new, because obviously there are so many people who don't fit into that very specific and relatively niche form, if we're being honest. And I think the sort of working for Roskte that has really, and working and really meeting people through that platform has really helped me to understand the importance of that work, but also really develop myself and push myself further.
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about fashion, of course, there's always the aspect of extreme exclusivity and unattainable goals for beauty. That said, within the Nordic countries, we also deal with the concept of the us and the other. But what I find really interesting about your work and also about the things we're talking about right now is what happens when you put all the other in a room together and say, go.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and that's what's beginning to happen. I think that's what Roskte certainly represents. But I think also that's what's represented in a lot of the creations that you're creating. Tell us a little bit more about, like you said, how you're able to create designs for the community. How are you able to help benefit a greater cause?
Yeah. So like I said, I would argue that all of my creative work, whether it's design, fashion, writing, etc., one way or another does revolve with the sort of intersecting identities that I possess. And it's an interesting thing, because it really is, like I said, for me, I do it because I feel that there is this story. I would argue that I am a storyteller, meaning that for me, oftentimes it's really more about the meaning of the clothing and the piece of clothing, rather than the actual. Yes, I'm focused on the design, but equally or even more, it really is about what it means and what do the specific design choices that I've made, what do they mean? And I think in the age of sustainability and etc., we talk a lot about how materials should be sustainable and the practices of making clothing should be sustainable. But I think in this fast fashion era, we need to understand that it's also a lot about what does the piece of clothing mean and what makes us really treasure it and hand it generations after generations to one another. So that I see that as such a crucial thing for my work, and it's just by doing it I realized that literally by getting DMs from people saying like that was so amazing and that was so special. I'm so thankful that I got to see. We had a little exhibit of the collection that I won with at a shopping center here in downtown Helsinki, and just understanding that there's meaning packed, even though it's for me and the people that I work with. The biggest reward has been getting those messages from people who've seen that, who for the first time feel that yes, even in countries like Finland, with the sort of image that we have in the world as this sort of remote white Nordic country, we have people like me who want to discuss the things that I want to discuss through fashion.
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk with BIPOC talent and creatives, one thing that I consistently hear is that experience of I was rewarded when someone came up to me and said, I didn't think girls like us could do this, or I didn't think boys like us could do this, or I didn't think that people who don't identify with the gender could do this, etc. Do you think that considering the importance of community give back, even considering community is a privilege? Do you think that not having to consider community is a privilege?
Yeah,
Because it's
that's a
certainly
great
something
question.
that BIPOC creatives, at least through the conversations I have, always talk about giving back to the community, helping other creatives. I may be the first, but I'm not going to be the last. That
Exactly.
narrative seems to be
Mhm.
extremely ingrained in BIPOC creative thinking. So, yeah, to clarify, do you think that not worrying about community,
Mhm.
not having to think about the next generation, is that a privilege?
Absolutely. And I would even, sort of rephrase what you're asking, that is it a privilege to be part of the norm? Absolutely. I know you know this, but I think there is a tendency, and any brown person, any black person could tell you this, that once, if you're the first, if you're doing something for the first time, or you become a prominent or known figure in something that you do, there's always this collective pressure that I'm not only representing myself, I am representing the community that I'm part of. And that is, again, a sort of an unthankful position to be in. And for example, I try to always remind myself that it's still just me if I don't become successful, or if I make a mistake. And not all gay brown people are the same, or I don't represent them as a sort of a pact. But that it truly, I think, is a privilege not to have that pressure on your shoulders, because it does. And I'm sure people have tendencies. I'm sure more. I would argue that I probably have a bigger tendency to worry about those things. But I think it also, when you don't have that pressure, it also sort of falsely, and when you're operating in a group, in a societal group, or in a group of industry people who don't have the pressure, there's also a tendency to, how to say this nicely, to reward oneself when you're doing the quote unquote extra work of including other people, because then it seems somehow it is something that you weren't supposed to do, because it's the responsibility of those other people, of those other marginalized people, to you're really handing out an arm and taking care of themselves, if you know what I mean. So I
Yeah.
think there's a bit of a blind spot sometimes, I would argue, there for some creatives, that really you're not like, great that you're including these and these type of people in your, say, cast of models or whatever, but this really is a us problem, and we all should take care of this. So
Right.
you should be equally worried about this burden, really, as I am, if you
Right.
understand what I mean.
Absolutely. Nobody is unaffected by structural
Exactly.
racism. Nobody
Yeah.
is unaffected by the lack of diversity in an industry. Let's
Exactly.
talk a little bit about uplifting talent and new voices. In your experience, what are some of the simple one sentence solutions that could do a lot of change?
In terms of including people who maybe normally aren't included,
Exactly.
I think.
In terms of both uplifting those who are just starting
Mhm.
out, which you were at
Yep.
one point, but also bringing and being more inclusive of voices that are maybe knocking on the door timidly, waiting to
Mhm.
walk in.
Mm. I think, yeah, I would even argue that there's probably a few answers to this. I would say one thing is, what's like a short way of saying that? Like having, if not patience, but having the willingness to go outside the box that you're in. So really, I think when, like I was saying, connected to what I said earlier, when you're in a position of power, it's very easy to sort of stay in that sort of circle that you have around yourself, and sort of share that power among that. But the more you have power, the more you have responsibility to stretch out of your sort of comfort zone, and stretch out of the people that you know, and see what other possibilities there are. So I guess, to say in one sentence, like you asked, have the willingness to look a bit further. Because oftentimes it's so easy to say that, oh, well, there's no black models in this city, Helsinki, or there's no trans writers for this, yada, yada, yada. But first of all, especially with the internet, the world is so small. So often those people do exist. It just requires a bit more effort to go beyond and share the power that you have. I would say that that's the biggest thing. And yeah, like as a, especially when if you're say a smaller designer or a starting brand, of course your resources are limited. So it's always a bigger risk to take a risk to try something new that you haven't tried before. I understand that, but I would still say that question what, even if you don't know, uh, if you're looking, say, I'm just going to give an example. If you're looking for a
Sure.
graphic designer and you don't know any, what are the people? What does that person look like that you would be comfortable working with if you don't know them at all? Know them at all? Is there a specific image of that graphic designer in Finland or Denmark, etc., that you're gonna be comfortable with? And what is the matter with that image? Is there another image of that person that you would be equal comfortable with? If not, there's a problem. So really, I would say it's also a lot about investigating how you perceive things and what biases you have.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm hearing both the willingness to put in the work and explore one's unconscious bias, but also,
Mm-hmm.
again, put in the work even when it's hard, even when it's not a
Exactly.
trend anymore, even when it might not directly provide you capital gain. What
Exactly. Yeah.
what can we do? What can we do to keep this, aside from having these conversations, aside
Mhm.
from spreading the word and meeting together and creating networks as we've done? What can
Mhm.
we do to make sure that people in positions of power
Mhm.
should and can be discussing their unconscious bias, figuring out how they can bring community into the ethos of their brand or publication?
Mhm.
What can we be doing?
Uh, I mean, keep up the good work.
We
Like,
Yeah, yeah,
no, there's not a treasure at the end of the rainbow. The rainbow is just gonna keep going, I'm afraid. But like,
sure.
yeah, keep up the work, but also, how to say this? Like, if not have trust, but like, understand that we have limits and that there's only so
Mhm.
much that we can do, say people like you and me, and understanding that we, like we said earlier, we can't really do these things alone. And it's
No.
also a lot about those people who are in the positions of power. So you and me, we can send endless amounts of, or put endless amounts of stories on our Instagram and have these conversations, yada yada yada. But sadly, I think there's still always a cap for how much change can happen over there. And we could talk endlessly, like what are the things that we can do, and I can recommend companies to pay for consultancy, etc. Like we do at Roskte, that we consult a lot of organizations. Hey, we do that, so
Nice
but
plug.
I think there still is a cap over there. Don't you think there's still a limit in terms of like what we can do? And that's one thing that I say in the consultancy that I do, that we don't really want to give a to-do list of this is how to fix your company. We can only explain the effects of what happens if we continue as we're doing things now, and we can explain how things could be better. But it really is up to the people who are in that power position to make that change and meet us halfway, really. And it's not going to be beneficial, it's not going to be thankful, it's not going to make more money necessarily, like you said, but it needs to be done.
Yeah. And sometimes it will make more money, and sometimes it will feel easy, but sometimes it
Mhm.
won't feel
Yeah,
easy, and sometimes it won't
yeah.
make money. But I think also talking about any sort of willingness to dismantle structures it's slow, tiring, and hard work because you have to spend
Mhm.
so much time identifying the structures,
Mhm.
identifying these unconscious bias and privileges that are all over.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, it's a bottom up, top down. The top has to want
Mhm.
to change and influence down the food chain, and grassroots activism is so important in influencing from the bottom up. So
Yeah.
with that said, I appreciate all of the work and all of the time that you spend dedicating to creating a more diverse and inclusive fashion industry in Finland and in the world. Thank you so much for your efforts.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
You're welcome. And yeah, again, as we've said before, these conversations about structural change, about the ingrained racist practices that are in the fashion industry at large will not be solved in a small conversation like this. However, I do really appreciate that we're able to at least just spotlight a few of the tendencies that are happening. For all of the folks out there that don't know of Roskte Tytöt, that there is a brown girls media platform in Finland. We need more of those all across the Nordic, and that there also are designers like yourself working tirelessly and endlessly to create more inclusive narratives for Black, brown, queer people in the Nordic region and also Finland specifically. So let's end on a good note and say one positive thing that can be done daily to dismantle a structure within the fashion industry. Ervin, go.
Oh, one thing. Oh boy. Understand that no one has. It's enough to investigate your own biases, and it's enough to focus. How to say? Not to fix yourself, but it's okay to focus on yourself and consider what things you're maybe doing right and what things you're doing wrong. Other people can worry about the big companies, etc. Other people can call people out, etc. It's fine if you don't, whether you're a white person, whether you're a brown person, black, etc. It's enough to focus on yourself, and that's fine. That's the one thing that I want to say.
Thank you so much and have a wonderful day, Ervin.
You too. Thank you.